Oh my God. Mind blown. Howdy and welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell. This is going to be my summer reading wrap-up, which I'm very excited about. I read 16 books in the months of June, July, and August. I read 6 fantasy books, 7 sci-fi books, and 3 books in a different category. One was a classic, one was a mystery thriller, and one was just kind of a general fiction. So I'm going to give reviews for all 16 of these books in those categories, doing fantasy first, then my other 3 books, and then the 7 sci-fi at the end. Gonna kick it off with the first book of the Book of the Ancestor series by Mark Lawrence. I feel like most people know Mark Lawrence for his earlier trilogy, The Broken Empire, The Prince of Thorns. And so this is his more recent trilogy, which kicks off with Red Sister. Red Sister is about this young girl named Nana. I think she's like 9 or 10 when the book starts. And her family sells her to a child buyer who looks for children that he thinks will have magical potential. She's originally sold to this like fighting ring. Things happen. Eventually, Nana goes to be with this nunnery called Sweet Mercy. And of course, this is a fantasy series, and so it's not your typical nunnery. Sweet Mercy trains all of its nuns and kind of acolytes in combat and magic and all sorts of really cool, fun stuff. I loved this book so much, and I loved this whole trilogy. So it just has like some really good action. It has some really good character development, and the side characters, I feel like especially in these books, are written very well, and it really kind of pulls you into this world that's so different from our own. My only complaint with this book was that Nana is, like I said, she's like 9 or 10 years old when the book starts, and Mark Lawrence struggles, I think, to write a child. She like puts things together in a very kind of logical way that you would expect an adult in those situations to be able to like put those pieces together. But I know some 9 and 10-year-olds, and I don't think that's quite how their brain works. And so I just felt like in some cases she was making decisions and had thoughts and ideas that were a little too mature for her, which wasn't a huge issue, but it did pull me out of the story just a little bit. As soon as I finished Red Sister, I moved immediately into Gray Sister, which is the sequel. I thought this one was even better than the first one. It kickstarted really well, and it was like action-packed, I felt, from beginning to end. One of the things that's really fascinating about this world is that they live on a planet that is essentially completely frozen over except for this equatorial zone, which is like the only livable part of the planet. And it is getting smaller and smaller every year as the planet continues to ice over. And so as it's icing over, it is pushing all of the civilizations closer and closer together because they have less and less land. And so that's causing a lot of conflicts. And at first, you don't really see a lot of that because you're focused on Nana and her training at the nunnery. But as she grows older, the issues of the world start to infiltrate the nunnery as these cultural pressures kind of move in and invade everywhere. And so that's super, super cool. The only complaint that I have about the second book was that I felt like Mark Lawrence used the phrase like she was moving as fast as she ever had, or she was like stronger than she had ever been, or like she punched harder than she had ever done before. And it was like every single fight scene was like that. And I was like, is it really like the most every single time? Like, I understand she's getting stronger as the book goes along, but it was just, or like faster. But yeah, it just seemed like it lost a little bit of the impact because it was a little bit overused as a phrase. But again, that was really minor, and it did not take away from the epicness of the story. And then after that, of course, is the conclusion to the trilogy, which is Holy Sister. This one I thought was probably the best of the 3. Like, it continued to get better and better. And I think I gave Red Sister like a 4.5, a 4.75 for Grey Sister, and then I just a solid 5 stars for Holy Sister. I would give the series overall 5 stars. I think it is an excellent, excellent fantasy. The battles were epic. The magic was stunning. The world was fascinating. You really care about the characters and their relationships. I mean, it was really just a journey. I have nothing negative to say about the third book at all. Also, this was super interesting, but I loved Mark Lawrence at the beginning of the second and third books gave like a little 1 to 3 page overview of like what happened in the previous book, which was really cool because it was like when you turn on your favorite TV show and it's like last week on whatever show you're watching. And then they give you like a little recap. And it was kind of like that. And it was like, even though I read them back to back to back, it was still really helpful to read because I was like, oh, it just said things so succinctly that I don't know, it like connected some dots that like had lines between them before, but like really solidified them and made going into the next book, like I felt like I was ready for it. You know what I mean? So I thought that was really cool that Mark Lawrence did that. And I would like to see more authors do that in the future. Book of the Ancestor was fantastic. Highly, highly recommend. Next up on the fantasy list that I read this summer is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I don't want to talk about this too much because I have a whole video dedicated to Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell where I compare the book to the TV show miniseries that the BBC did back in like 2015, I think. I loved this book. I thought the writing was an absolute masterpiece. It was a bit slow in the middle, but I just loved the writing style so much, and the story had like really epic proportions. It is about the only 2 practicing magicians in England during the Napoleonic Wars and kind of their dynamics and relationship and how they get tangled up in the Fae and the wars and the politics of England at the time. So if that sounds interesting to you, definitely check out my Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell video. The 5th fantasy book that I read this summer was Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. I loved this book. I read it in a day. It's very short. This is also my first T. Kingfisher book, and it just came out earlier this year. This was one of the ones that I read during our time in California earlier this summer, and so I do have a vlog where I mention and talk about this book, so you can check that out here. But it was just utterly delightful. The main character in Nettle and Bone is this young woman named Mara. I guess she's not that young. I think she's like 30, but it flashes back to her childhood several times. And Mara is a princess of a very tiny kingdom, and their kingdom has a lot of political pressure from both sides, and so her older sisters are married off to princes of neighboring kingdoms in order to maintain alliances and keep everything safe and secure. Mara is saved from that fate because her older sisters kind of fell on that blade for her, and so she has a very different life than what they have. But one of her sisters ends up being married to a very cruel prince, and he is abusive and terrible, and when she finds out, she wants to do something to save her sister from this terrible situation. And so she ends up going on this very like epic fairy tale journey to try and save her sister. She meets up with this very interesting cast of characters. She has to do 3 impossible tasks. And so just the way that the book starts out, like the very first chapter, I was just engrossed. I don't want to give anything away, but I could tell I was just going to love this book. And Mara is just such an interesting fantasy protagonist because she's so unlike other fantasy protagonists that I've read in so many books, because she's just like very unassuming. She doesn't want to be the hero. She wants someone else to come in and save the day, but she realizes that no one is doing that. And so she has to step up and kind of take over. She describes herself as like short and plump, and she loves embroidery, but has no real world skills. That's all I'm going to say about that one. It was delightful. And like I said, a super quick read. Highly recommend. The next fantasy book that I read this summer was Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. I'm sure everyone on BookTube has heard about this book already. It is as delightful and cozy as everyone says it is. It is about an orc woman who has been an adventurer her whole life, and she's tired of this lifestyle and wants to just open a coffee shop. And it's so cozy. It has a very found family vibe, and it's just about the trials and tribulations of opening a coffee shop. I was a little worried about this because I was like, well, that doesn't sound like very much of a plot as someone who reads a lot of epic and high fantasy. But it's not like there's no conflict. There's like a mob in town and there's debts that need to be paid. And yeah, it's more than just a coffee shop story, but it is just a coffee shop story. And it's delightful the whole way through. And I just felt very in love with these characters and very devoted to seeing them through. And again, this was another one that I read in a single day. It was just so fun, and I couldn't wait to get back to it when I put it down. So that was all of the fantasy that I read this summer. So now I want to move on to the more general, kind of my mixed category. I read 3 books that did not fall in fantasy or sci-fi, so I want to go into those next. The first one is a just general fiction book called The Monkey Wrench Gang by Edward Abbey. You may remember this one if you saw my mid-year book freakout, because I did talk about this one there. This one is about a returned Vietnam veteran named Hayduke, and he goes on a river rafting trip. He meets up with 3 like-minded individuals who are all very upset about the way things are going in the West. The higher population, people were building more roads and bulldozing and more dams, more bridges, more power plants, and really just destroying the environment these people love so much. And so they become eco-terrorists together, which kind of has like a fun romp, a little bit of maybe like found family and, a lot of mischievous happenings. I feel like this had the potential to be really great, but it was written in 1975 by a very old school guy named Edward Abbey, and it just had some really cringy stuff in it as far as sexism and racism. And so even though I really wanted to love this book because the story was so fun and kind of timeless, it didn't hit it for me. And so I don't really recommend this book, but I've heard that Edward Abbey has some really beautiful nonfiction along that environmentalism vein. And so I would like to check out some of his other works, but I don't think I will read any more fiction by him in the future. The next other category that I have is a mystery thriller called Finlay, Donovan is Killing It. This is the very first book that I read on my summer vacation this year, which I talk about in my first part 1 of the California bookpacking adventure vlog. This was my airport read for that vacation, and I was just looking for something kind of fun and different, and I had heard a lot of other people talking about just what a fun little read this was. And it didn't hit for me the way that I wanted it to. It's a story about a mom who's really struggling. She's also trying to be a writer. And long story short, someone dies and he ends up in her vehicle, and she is trying to find out who killed this person before she gets pinned for the murder. It's a very interesting plot. It just lacked a little bit of believability for me, and the character Finlay herself, I thought, was just a little bit annoying. She was a very much #hot mess mama type of person. And so I feel like for so many readers, this is probably a very relatable woman, especially if you're a young mom and you feel like you're always overwhelmed. But for me, it was just okay. The last book that doesn't really fit into fantasy or sci-fi that I read this summer was Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This book came out in 1890. It is a classic, and it is a bit of a gothic horror genre. I think most people are aware of kind of the plot. Dorian Gray is this guy who is incredibly handsome, and he stays forever young because he basically sold his soul, and he has a portrait of himself that grows old, but he does not. It has a lot of philosophy and really interesting kind of takes on culture and society at the time. And some of that is still relevant today, I think. But Oscar Wilde definitely writes dialogue in a way that no real person has ever spoken. It was a very stylized kind of feel. None of the characters are likable in this book. And there is one entire chapter that is literally just like a list and description of like tapestries and jewels and random things that Dorian is buying. It was a really hard chapter to get through. But overall, I think if you're wanting to read a classic, this was super short and had a very interesting story that I enjoyed. But I think if you're not into classics, or if that doesn't sound like something that would interest you, probably look for a different classic. So now we're on to sci-fi. I read 6 science fiction books this summer, starting with Lovecraft Country. Is another one that I mentioned in my mid-year book freakout. I listened to this one on audiobook and is actually the only audiobook I've listened to so far this year. This is by Matt Ruff, and I thought this was okay. It definitely was not as good as I hoped. I thought it started out super strong and I was super intrigued. It's a story about a Black man during the Jim Crow era, and his father disappears while looking into a bunch of stuff about their family's ancestry, and he goes to try and find him along with his uncle and his friend. It had a lot of promise, and it promises, of course, with the title, some Lovecraftian horror type stuff that's going to happen, and I didn't get enough of that. It was also actually more of a series of short stories that all focused on different people that were all somehow kind of tied to Atticus or people that he knew. Some of them were interesting, some weren't. And then it all kind of ties together at the end. And I thought the ending had a lot of potential to make a really strong statement. And instead, it kind of went campy all of a sudden at the end. And I just didn't understand why it ended that way. And so it kind of ended in a bit of a flop. But I still thought the story was interesting. And I thought that the horror element of describing the fear and the unknownness of being Black in America during Jim Crow was done really, really well. 3 of the science fiction books that I read this summer were part of the Expanse series. So I started reading The Expanse with Leviathan Wakes, and then I read Caliban's War, and the third one was Abbadon's Gate. And so I have a lot to say about those because I'm a huge fan of the Expanse series on Prime Video, and that's why I actually started reading these books. I think the books are excellent so far. I'm reading the 4th one right now, but I am doing a book club style video for the Expanse series with my mom, my husband, and my brother. And so I'm not going to say too much about those right now, other than they're really fun, and I'll have videos about those coming sometime before the end of the year. The next science fiction book that I read this summer was The Cyberiad by Stanislaw Lem. This was another one that I read during the vacation this summer, and so I talk about that quite a bit throughout the California bookpacking adventure vlogs. This one I think is very cute. It is an absurdist style of writing. So if you like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams, I think this one is a good one for you to check out. It is not as good as Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but it is kind of a philosophical set of short stories that focuses on these 2 robots from the future who are called constructors, and they can build whatever they want, and they try and solve problems through these like genius inventions that they build. And they love to tell stories and brag about themselves and how great they are. And so it's just really absurd and whimsical and fun. It does get really repetitive in the middle, but overall, it was just a fun read. I'm glad I read it, especially because this came out in 1965, and I think probably set the tone for a lot of what people come to expect from absurdist sci-fi. The next science fiction book that I read this summer is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. I was super excited to read this because the book had been recommended to me by a coworker, and I've also heard the show is really good. I haven't seen the show yet, but I look forward to watching it now that I've read the book. I gave this a 5 out of 5. It was honestly so well written. It kicks off with a pandemic hitting the planet, and this was written before COVID. And it just brought back all of those feelings so hard, and really like the anxiety and the unknownness of like what is happening, except the pandemic in this book happens like it covers the globe and kills people like within 48 hours. And so people are just stranded wherever they are whenever it hits. And like society just completely breaks down because it has like an over 99% kill rate. And so there's very few people left. The book bounces back and forth between when the pandemic first kicks off and then 20 years in the future when we're in this like post-apocalyptic world, and how people have adapted. And it chooses probably like 5 different point of view characters that we kind of bounce back and forth and see what their life was like before and then what it's like after. So that was a really interesting way to go about this. And all of the 5 point of view characters are tied together by the singular person that they knew in the before times. They don't necessarily all know each other, but some of them do. That was a really interesting kind of lens to tell the story. But the main focus of the story in the post-apocalyptic world is this crew of traveling actors and performers and musicians who are just trying to make a living out in their like traveling troupe, and the things that happen to them as they travel from town to town to perform. I think this book is really, even though it has some extremely dark, horrifying things that happen, in the end, I feel like this book ends on like a very hopeful kind of note and just shows like the strength of humanity and how we can come together as communities and really like survive these sort of monstrous events beyond our control. The very last book that I read this summer is called Exhalation by Ted Chiang. This has 9 short stories in it. Oh my God. Mind blown. Like, I loved these. I just totally adored all of these stories. I cannot wait to get my hand on Ted Chiang's other collection of short stories. He's the same author that wrote the short story that the movie Arrival was based off of, and Arrival was an excellent film. Yeah, I can't wait. Ted Chiang is a master of science fiction, and you should read him. If you like science fiction, these are the stories that really exemplify like what the core of science fiction is about, and that is making us question our future and our reality and what's next for the human race. So that's everything that I read this summer. I had such an awesome reading summer, only 4 books that were not 4-star or above, and there were none that were 2 stars. So yeah, just overall very excited to continue reading excellent books the rest of the year. And thank you guys so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe. I have a whole bunch of good stuff coming up soon. I have more bookish content to come.